Pillars of Eternity wasn't the first modern isometric CRPG, but it was the first that fully evoked the classic Infinity Engine games. Shadowrun Returns, Divinity Original Sin, and Wasteland 2 all beat it to market, but they were turn-based and didn't have pre-rendered backgrounds. Pillars of Eternity has real-time with pause combat and beautiful pre-rendered backgrounds. In many ways, Pillars of Eternity looks a lot more like Baldur's Gate 3 than Baldur's Gate 3. This sounds a little cheesy, but you can absolutely feel the love and respect the devs have for what I call the holy trinity of Infinity Engine games: Baldur's Gate 2, Icewind Dale, and Planescape Torment. There's not a single screen, fight, or dialogue box that doesn't take something from those games. And yet Obsidian wasn't content to copy and modernise what came before. It took risks. I expected the attribute and skill system to be as close to Dungeons & Dragons as it could get without inviting lawsuits, but Obsidian created a drastically different one instead. Obsidian launched a new property with its own distinct identity, while also largely satisfying fans of the original games. No easy feat, I'm sure. The end result is that Pillars of Eternity is a pretty good game. It's not a great one though, and doesn't live up to the excellence achieved by Baldur's Gate 2 or Planescape Torment in particular. However, we should remember that as great as those games were, there was also the less adored Baldur's Gate 1 and the even more niche Icewind Dale. Pillars of Eternity sits comfortably between the greats and the not so greats. It's no classic, but it's damn good nonetheless. Pillars of Eternity was born from a place of desperation. In 2011, Obsidian was developing a game for Microsoft, codenamed North Carolina, with a planned title of Stormlands. Stormlands would have been a third-person RPG for the next Microsoft console, now of course known as Xbox One. Microsoft understandably wanted something a little special for its new console, and had ideas of the entire worldwide player base getting together for raids. The term million-man raids was actually thrown around, although according to an interview with Eurogamer, it was always understood that this was a bit of a reach. Microsoft also wanted Kinect integration. Remember Kinect? In early 2012, Fergus Urquhart of Obsidian got a phone call. Stormlands was cancelled.
So in March of 2012, we were working on a next generation console game.
It was really exciting, but it was a lot of work, and unfortunately, the game got canceled.
With these larger budgets, when you crash hard.
With hindsight, we now know that this was just one of many ambitious games Microsoft would cancel, after somehow concluding that not making games for its games console was a solid long-term strategy. Obsidian was thrown into disarray. Redundancies soon followed, and the remaining skeleton crew set to work throwing ideas at the wall to see if any would stick. Obsidian pitched proposals to publishers like Ubisoft and 2K, and even shipped the idea of Stormlands around, although unsurprisingly there weren't any takers for a game that Microsoft had already decided wasn't good enough. Then Double Fine launched its Kickstarter campaign for an old school point and click adventure game that would come to be known as Broken Age. The team at Obsidian already knew Kickstarters could raise large sums of money. However, Double Fine's Kickstarter proved the platform could fund revival projects for long-forgotten genres with a niche audience. Obsidian quickly put together a Kickstarter for Project Eternity and set a goal of $1.1 million. With Obsidian's reputation for excellent RPGs such as New Vegas and Knights of the Old Republic 2, the Kickstarter blew through its goal within 27 hours and ended up raising over $4 million when including separate donations through PayPal. Success comes with its own problems. Or so I'm told. It'd be nice to find out one day. Anyway, with all the money coming in, the team felt obliged to keep adding stretch goals that it hadn't planned for, such as a mega dungeon and a stronghold, both of which did make it into the game but represent some of the weaker content. The size of the dungeon was dependent on the number of Kickstarter backers, with a new floor added for every 2,500 backers. It ended up being 15 floors deep. Obsidian also offered direct incentives for higher support levels, such as getting your name in the game or designing an NPC. I don't blame Obsidian for offering these additional bonuses, but I do think they detract from the final product a touch. The random names on tombs aren't too bad. After clicking on one, it soon becomes apparent what's going on and you can ignore the rest. There's even a loading screen that advises you to do this if you don't want to break immersion. However, the NPCs are probably a step too far. Usually in games like this, if an NPC has a name, you can and probably should speak to them. They typically have a quest or useful information. The Kickstarter backer NPCs don't. Instead, you can read their minds and get some random backstory. And there are a lot of them. Again, you do figure out that the NPCs with the gold nameplates don't have anything to offer, so you stop trying. And I did eventually see a load screen that told me what the hell was going on with these. But it's not great. Don't get me wrong, if it's a choice between not having the game even get made or having it made but with these weird quirks, I'll take the latter every day. I just don't love it. The critics didn't seem overly concerned. Pillars of Eternity was incredibly well received, averaging about a 9 out of 10, and seemed to largely satisfy its target audience. Sales were about 700,000 in the first year, although that number is likely a lot higher now, following the release of the Definitive Edition, which included the White March expansion, and the console ports. There was even a Switch release in 2019. As we'll see, I don't love Pillars of Eternity, but regardless, it has to go down as a huge success story for Kickstarter, for old school genre revivals, and for Obsidian and everyone working there. Although Pillars of Eternity looks like the Holy Trinity at a glance, Obsidian made a lot of tweaks to how the game plays, mainly in the name of accessibility and shaving off some of the rough edges. This is most evident in the combat system, which is certainly easier to pick up than the D&D rule set used in those Infinity Engine games. As much as I love some of those older games, there's no denying that they had their oddities and weren't exactly friendly to those not already familiar with a decades-old tabletop RPG. Pillars of Eternity didn't have an established system to go off, and even if it did, it's good practice to assume players don't know anything about a game when starting out. So first of all, there's no THAC0, which, while not complicated, was weird to new players. Damage output is now based on percentage increases instead of whole number modifiers. The D&D system is not too bad when comparing similar weapons, but I found it confusing when trying to say compare 1d8 plus 1 plus 2 compared to a 2d6 plus 1 weapon. The new system of say 25 to 32 base damage plus 15% is much clearer for me at least. In combat you compare the attacker's accuracy to the applicable defense stat, e.g. deflection. This determines what you need to roll out of 100 and then what type of hit you will make depending on your roll. No matter how bad your accuracy compared to the defense, you always have a chance to at least get a graze attack and do some damage. The amount of damage you deal depends on your damage output and the enemy's damage reduction, although again you will always be able to do some damage. Clearly the team decided that seeing a small damage number was a lot less demoralising than no damage at all. And in a similar vein, Obsidian didn't want there to be any bad builds. In a GDC presentation, Josh Sawyer talked about wanting to reduce the gap between viable and optimal. He didn't want players to have to start again or reduce the difficulty after 5 hours because they were unhappy with their build choices. I highly recommend watching this presentation, by the way. Josh Sawyer is an incredible speaker and he takes what could have been a dry topic and makes it compelling. He's been playing tabletop RPGs for over 30 years and there are a few people in the industry with his level of knowledge on the topic. I actually wish I'd watched it before playing because he explains the systems better than the game does, and he drew my attention to a user created chart that is so useful I probably should have printed it and stuck it to my second monitor while playing. Anyway, the major change is to character attributes. I initially thought it was the standard 6 attributes again with some slightly different names, so might instead of strength and intellect instead of intelligence, etc. Other players must make that assumption too because Obsidian actually added little silver and gold symbols next to the attributes you should focus on the most for your class. The changes are interesting. Sawyer didn't want any dump stats, so each attribute has broader application than what you'd initially expect. Might isn't just for melee damage, it's for all types of damage. Therefore, a wizard with damage dealing spells needs at least a half decent might stat. Conversely, intellect isn't as crucial for a wizard as you'd expect. Intellect doesn't limit the level of spells you can use, just their area of effect and duration. So you can make a wizard with high might and low intellect that deals a lot of damage in a small area. Likewise, while resolve is important for paladins, it's not as crucial as charisma is for them in D&D. This system certainly leads to some odd quirks of its own. Might affects damage dealt by guns as well, which just feels wrong. And in the dialogue and choose your own adventure sections, the attributes have their more traditional meaning, so might is purely about strength in those cases. But overall, Sawyer and the team succeeded in creating many more viable builds and reducing the impact of dump stats. I did still treat resolve as a dump stat for my character because I didn't fully appreciate how vulnerable it made me to attacks that hit my will or deflection defences, which ended up being most of them because my character kept their distance. Speaking of my character, I created a really interesting godlike cipher. Godlike is the name of a race thought to be blessed by the gods. There are 4 types of godlike that you can play as, and they have a distinctive look about them, with horns, feathers, or even fire on their heads. Outside of godlikes, the races are a little dull. There are human elves and dwarves, of course. Sawyer said he didn't want half-orcs or halflings, so he took them out, only to replace them with one large and one small race, so maybe not especially inventive there. The Cypher class is a lot like Wizard or Priest classes in that their attacks are magical, except they work by targeting other souls, which means the Cypher can't cast a spell on empty ground or even on themselves. Their attacks use focus, which first has to be built up through normal attacks. My early game Cypher was close to useless, having to survive seemingly ages while dishing out weak attacks to build up focus, and then only having a couple of mediocre abilities to choose from. However, in the second half of the game, my Cypher became insanely powerful and could literally blow enemies' minds. I had more fun with Pillars of Eternity's character creation than any since probably Arcanum's. However, the level up process is a lot less interesting. Each level you're granted 6 skill points to allocate to one of 5 skills. This should be an important part of developing your character, but the skills are so boring that I barely cared where I put the points. You should probably have a party member who can pick locks, so they'll of course need mechanics. Other than that, well, I guess your tanks want athletics because that increases endurance. Lore seemed like a no-brainer for my Cypher and Priest, but really it's only useful when you want to use scrolls, which are a very small part of the game for me personally. Survival gives you buffs after sleeping. It's fairly minor stuff and not suitable as the main reward per level up. Unlike with D&D, the damage adjustment per level is linear, which I don't think is a bad idea necessarily, but it does contribute to a slightly underwhelming feeling you have when leveling up. My main complaint with character builds is that there are so many stats, it's hard to remember exactly what impact each has and which should take precedence. Characters have attributes, skills, abilities, active effects, and talents. Some abilities can become talents, I think, so my fighter has the weapon specialization as a knight ability, but he also has the weapon mastery as a knight talent. Seems like it would make more sense to just upgrade the ability instead of separating it out into a talent. Look at the summary for any remotely well-geared character. Even without dosing up on potions and scrolls, your stat page is just chock full of buffs and nerfs, and at a glance it's hard to spot a character's strengths and weaknesses. There are active effects applying to everything from main attributes to buffs to specific types of defense, or to all types of defense but only while stunned, to damage reduction against certain attacks, and so on. This system made comparing gear a lot harder than it needed to be. Should I go with +1 constitution or +3 might or +2 athletics with a +1 reflex, that kind of thing? On top of this, most of the gear buffs don't stack, so if you have gloves with +1 might and a chest piece with +3 might, then only the +3 applies. This is explained in a stacking section in the help menu, but it's the sort of thing you only think to look for when you've already identified stacking as a problem. I only noticed it because I was trying to reach a particular stat level and I couldn't figure out why the numbers weren't adding up properly. Perhaps the stat should be in red or crossed out if it's not going to apply. And of course it's not as simple as nothing stacking. Some stats, like those on weapons, do stack. Thing is, none of this counts as difficult. There was nothing I couldn't have figured out given some time and patience. The terms are clearly defined with pop-ups, so understanding any one thing is easy. However, there are so many terms that I found the interaction of them to be somewhat overwhelming. Fortunately, I didn't need to stress about the intricacies of stacking all that often because Pillars of Eternity is fairly easy. After a rocky start, medium difficulty presented little challenge, and I finished with more money, scrolls and consumables than I knew what to do with. Interestingly, the easy, medium and hard difficulties don't change enemy stats at all. Instead, you face different enemy compositions, which is a cool way to add or remove challenge. Pillars of Eternity makes a lot of small changes to the old school games, and most of them improve the experience to some extent. In one of my previous videos I complained about how difficult it could be to use magic in the Infinity Engine games, because descriptions would say things like, "This has a 20-foot radius," and expect you to know what that looked like on screen. Pillars of Eternity shows you a clear area of effect in yellow. There's sometimes a smaller red circle which signifies a friendly fire zone. It couldn't be clearer. I also complained about the time spent constantly stacking buffs before every major encounter. Well, you can't do that here. Most spells can only be used in combat. Another complaint of mine related to the interaction of health and the camping system. Outside of big battles, the major threat in Infinity Engine games was simply attrition. Not many encounters posed a threat by themselves because you had large health bars, but over time that health would get whittled down, at which point you would set up camp or find an inn. Pillars of Eternity attempts to change that with modest success. In addition to a health bar, you have an endurance meter, which is substantially smaller. If a character loses all their endurance during a fight, they get knocked down for the rest of that encounter. If they all get knocked down, then it's game over. This means even having a full health bar only gets you so far, because in combat it's endurance that counts. Every encounter is a threat. In addition, there are very few spells or potions that apply to health, so you can't just heal up your party after each fight by spamming spells and drinking loads of potions. The camping system has also changed, although it's not as substantial an improvement as I'd hoped. You're now limited in how often you can camp. You need camping equipment, and on medium you can only carry 4, or 2 on hard. That sounds limiting, but in practice it's actually easier to camp in Pillars of Eternity than it is in the older games, because in Pillars you never get woken from sleep by enemies, and so you can sleep in even the most dangerous dungeons. And 4 sleeps really should be enough for most areas. If it's not, you're either under-leveled or not supposed to do it in one hit anyway. Another change is the XP system, although again it ended up not having the impact I expected. So you're told that XP is no longer awarded per kill and is instead awarded for completing quests. That's a big change on paper. Killing enemies only grants you more information in the bestiary, which helps you identify enemy strengths and weaknesses. That sounds like a solid system, right? Well, it turns out you get XP for expanding the bestiary entries and for uncovering the map, so you are still rewarded for exploring and getting in more fights. To be fair, I still think there is a balance shift here to rewarding you more for quests than for fighting, but it doesn't change the overall experience much. One cool feature is that you have an unlimited stash. No more leaving behind loot. You can pick up every crappy wooden spear you come across. You can turn the stash off, but it's on by default. Unfortunately, this does mean you can easily break the economy and have more money than you'll ever need by, say, the halfway point. You don't get much money for selling cheap gear, but it adds up quickly when you sell hundreds at a time. Overall, I found the combat more enjoyable than that of the D&D games. And even though the tweaks to the system weren't game-changing as such, I do consider them to be improvements. The big fights were especially enjoyable. I used to hate boss encounters in the likes of Baldur's Gate because there'd always be a couple of mages who would immediately take out half my party with Dominate or Confuse type spells, or my mages would have the wrong spells memorised and not be able to counter the specific attacks being used. Enemy wizards are still powerful in Pillars of Eternity, but I felt better equipped to deal with them. My priest could not only protect companions from spells like Charmed, he could also reduce the duration of negative effects after they'd been applied, and I didn't have to rely on having the correct spells memorised or anything like that. These big fights played out like tactical challenges that had me searching through my long list of abilities for the right move. And you have a lot of options across the board. Even my fighter had a couple of reliable moves that he could perform multiple times per encounter, such as knocking enemies to the floor. Having moves be per encounter instead of per rest or per game day makes me use them so much more. The Infinity Engine games offered some class moves like this, but they were so limited, especially at the start, so I never got in the habit of using them. If anything, Pillars of Eternity gives you way too many things you can do on a per encounter basis. By the time I'd gone through my list of per encounter moves, like knocking enemies to the floor or performing a sweeping attack, the fight would be over. Normal spells are still on a per rest basis, but the number of uses is generous, and I never had a problem past the 5-hour mark or so. Clearly this was assigned to increase the difficulty, but I was quite happy with the length of combat encounters as it stood. There are too many fights in my opinion to have them drag on forever. And on that note, Pillars of Eternity forced me to accept something uncomfortable and troubling about myself. I think I prefer turn-based combat to real-time with pause combat in games like this. Don't worry, I haven't fully embraced turn-based combat as such. It's more the approach to combat generally that I prefer in games like Divinity Original Sin. Turn-based encounters take a lot longer, but that means there's fewer of them. Each fight is more important and there isn't such a focus on attrition. The action is clearer because you can see and react to every move the enemy makes without having to keep pausing to scroll through a tedious combat log. Encounters in Pillars of Eternity can be a visual mess when spells start flying around, and even zoomed in you can't always see what's going on. Turn-based combat where you control everyone also means you don't have to worry about the AI, which can be a little rough here, and yes, I did make sure it was turned on this time. The AI was added late, and you can tell. Companions often won't attack enemies standing right next to them, regardless of the AI settings. Summoned enemies don't do anything unless instructed, so my chance often had a group of skeletons hanging around him like a sad-looking entourage. If anything, you'd expect summoned enemies not to be controllable at all and to sort of work on autopilot. So yeah, I think the combat system is an improvement from the games that inspired it, but I'm still not loving real time with pause and the associated cannon fodder enemies that get thrown at you to wear down your health bar. Speaking of getting worn down, Pillars of Eternity has a massive dungeon called the Endless Paths of Odnua. 15 floors of slogging through fights until an encounter with a massive dragon at the end. Of course, you don't do it all in one go. I completed 2 or 3 floors at a time, at which point there'd usually be a difficulty spike suggesting I come back later. As discussed, this dungeon was a Kickstarter stretch goal, so I suppose expectations should be set accordingly. But nevertheless, I was disappointed not to see many puzzles in here. I wanted something more in line with the incredible Durlag's Tower from Baldur's Gate's expansion. I got something more akin to a typical Icewind Dale dungeon, with almost the entire focus being on combat. The final floors are genuinely challenging though, and the end boss took many reloads to beat. Outside of special dungeons, the difficulty is pitched a little low. I've already mentioned how I struggled to get to grips with the intricacies of its systems, and yet I coasted through a medium. That suggests to me that people who actually know what they're doing and have patience will find it way too easy. It doesn't help that it's really easy to get over-leveled for quests. The White March expansion and the final mission offer to increase the difficulty if you're too high a level, but that seems to go too far the other way, and regardless, it doesn't help with all the other quests. And conversely, there are many quests that you will be way under-leveled for if you tackle them when first assigned, but you won't know that until you try them. One of, if not the hardest mission in the game, Siege of Cragholt, is given to you early. The first time I went there I got my ass kicked, which was a pretty clear sign I wasn't ready, but the problem then becomes knowing when you are ready. I had to keep going back to make sure, and lots of quests are like this, and sometimes I'd forget to go back for a while, and by the time I did I was now over-leveled. This probably won't be a popular suggestion, but I think these games need to include a recommended level on each quest. I know that's a bit modern and the old games didn't do it, but would it really hurt that much? It would have helped me a lot. Before discussing the story, I do want to acknowledge how beautiful most of this game looks. The pre-rendered backgrounds are absolutely stunning, way more detailed than they needed to be, and the 3D lighting engine plus some moving parts like waterfalls make the world feel less static than it otherwise would. Early on I kept trying to rotate the camera because the world felt 3D like say Divinity Original Sin, not pure isometric like the Infinity Engine games. Character models look good within the game as well, less so when seen up close in the menus unfortunately. The view isn't pure isometric, it's been shifted a little bit, although you'd be hard pushed to notice until you say go indoors where there's a 7-degree adjustment to stop the camera getting stuck on walls and things. The cost of these impressive visuals is an ungodly number of loading screens. You can't do much of anything without loading. Any building, no matter the size, requires a load to get into, as does moving between floors in those buildings. It can be quite a pain when you're just moving between NPCs to progress a quest. I can understand if the locations were big, but they really aren't, even in Defiance Bay. Now the loading screens weren't long with an SSD, but they weren't exactly blink and you'll miss them either. Unfortunately, whereas the combat had some notable improvements on what came before, the story is a big swing and a miss. More accurately, the execution of the story is a mess. There is way too much exposition and world building right from the word go. I'm actually annoyed that I ranted about world building in my video on the Age of Decadence. It's even more egregious here, but I don't want to repeat myself. Suffice it to say that there is more to telling a good story than world building. Game developers are particularly guilty of obsessing over the world and factions, religions and magic systems, etc., and then treating the actual story as an afterthought. It's understandable, I suppose. It is much easier to write high-level descriptions or summaries of stories than it is to actually script out a story and design characters people care about with arcs, proper pacing, etc. The story is also overly serious. In the base game, there are no fun companions or characters. There's no Minsk or Mort, no silly quests, no attempt at comic relief at all. It is 100% serious from beginning to end, and it's exhausting. I found myself clicking through paragraphs of text without taking anything in. Now, I think I have a high threshold for boring writing. I got through 3 years of law school, but this was too much. I resorted to skimming text to get the gist of what was going on. This is a shame because when you strip out the layers upon layers of padding, there is a decent enough story here. Nothing remarkable perhaps, but with a couple of tweaks to character motivations, it could be pretty enjoyable. Pillars of Eternity takes place in a country called Deerwood, which is basically a Renaissance-era European place. To its credit, Obsidian later admitted that this was a touch unoriginal. You start as a newcomer to Deerwood, travelling with a caravan which is promptly attacked. You flee to a cave to hide out a storm, and you end up becoming what's known as a Watcher after seeing a machine rip people's souls from their bodies. Reincarnation is real in this world, and a Watcher is someone who can see people's memories from past lives. Shortly after this, you discover that Deerwood suffers from the Hollowborn Plague, which causes some children to be born without souls. People blame animancers for the plague. Animancy is the study of souls, and animancers are generally a suspicious-looking lot conducting experiments in secret. You can understand why people would link increased animancy activity to the new plague involving souls. However, animancers are actually being framed by the big bad Theos, who kills Duke Avar and sets up an impressive mid-game riot in Defiance Bay. I really enjoyed this part. There was a big hearing where I convinced the Duke that animancers weren't to blame for all the problems, and all seemed to be going well when Theos strolled in, executed Duke Avar, and left behind a riot. You spend the rest of the game chasing after Theos, although chasing implies a level of urgency that isn't really present. I lost all interest in the story until the end when the game hit you with some impressive revelations. First of all, gods aren't real. Well, they are real, they just aren't gods as such. They were created by an ancient civilization known as Enwithians, who were also big into animancy. Through their animancy, which was way more advanced than what the world currently has, Enwithians discovered that their own gods were not real. They knew this would eventually become public knowledge and were worried about the impact it might have on the general population. After all, entire societies and morality systems had evolved on the assumption that gods were real. Take that away and you might get chaos. The Enwithians therefore decided to create the gods themselves. These quote-unquote gods then proved to the world that they were real, cementing faith for generations to come and generally encouraging people to be nice to one another. The Enwithians also suppressed knowledge of animancy because, well, there's no point going to the effort to create fake gods if the next generation is just going to make the same discovery. Theos is one of these Enwithians who has survived for generations by passing his soul from body to body. He's teamed up with one of the fake gods, Woodica, to destroy animancy completely. Hence he created the Hollowborn Plague and ensured animancy was blamed. The other fake gods agree to work with you to stop Theos because they don't particularly like Woodica, who wants to be queen of the fake gods. You can choose which god to work with, and each wants you to deal with the lost souls in a particular way. I elected to return the lost souls to the bodies they were supposed to inhabit, which does seem like a rather obvious solution. I enjoyed the ending a lot, but the journey was dull, and I think that's because the story focuses too much on your character's personal desire to rid themselves of Watcher status, instead of on the Hollowborn Plague. Now to me, the plague seems so much more urgent. Newborn children are still being born without souls. You can't just leave them to grow up as soulless husks or you'll end up with the Republican Party. Now both stories connect at the end, but in a coincidental and unsatisfying manner. I can see why the story was structured this way. It's always a good idea to give your character a personal connection to the bigger story to serve as motivation beyond vague saving the world narratives. I've made that point myself in previous videos. However, I don't think not being a Watcher anymore is especially compelling motivation. Sure, some Watchers go mad, but that's not always the case. When people find out you're a Watcher, they are typically quite impressed. They certainly don't pity you. Your power can be genuinely helpful in understanding the past, and you occasionally use it to get an edge in conversations. It's a superpower of sorts. Alright, it's not the one I'd pick given a choice, but it's still a useful tool. As motivations go, removing superpowers, not a strong one. A personal connection to one of the Hollowborn children or the town itself might have been more appropriate. Removing your Watcher abilities lacks any kind of impetus, so of course none of the quests have any urgency to them. Your journal splits the quests into categories of main, secondary and tasks. However, if you were to read the descriptions without the labels, you'd be hard pushed to know which quests were important and which were optional. More broadly, the quests as a whole are boring. Nothing grabbed my attention when I read the quest summaries. I completed most of them because I wanted the XP and I just felt a broader obligation to see all the content because of this video. I didn't care though. Even the companion quests I completed were uninspiring. These should be opportunities to develop close relationships with party members, but most of them have less personality than the soulless husks you're trying to save. Quite often the journal just says talk to them to find out more, so you talk to them, get a few more lines, and then they say they want to talk more later. And talking to them isn't fun anyway because of the aforementioned problem with excessive world building. Every conversation is an info dump of names and places without any reason to care. Obsidian admitted that it should have included a system like the one later used in Tyranny, I think, where you can hover over words to get a reminder of who that person is or why that place is significant. Now that would help, I suppose, but it's only covering up the underlying problem, which is that there's way too much background information to keep track of. The end result is paragraphs and paragraphs of nouns. People and places you've never heard of or visited and with no reason to care about any of them. It is somewhat ironic that if I were to describe Pillars of Eternity's story with one word, it would be soulless. Now the story isn't all bad. You can make more choices than in your typical CRPG for a start. Not just with the ending either. Your decisions over the course of the game impact a lot of people, which is then reflected in the longest series of ending slides I've ever seen, coming in at nearly 15 minutes. I'm a sucker for ending slides, so this is a big tick in the positive column for me. There are moments where you feel the Planescape Torment inspiration coming through. Philosophical debates about how much information the general population should be given, the importance of preserving history versus leaving it in the past, and of course the merits of a belief system where the gods aren't real but then were made real but then aren't really gods in the traditional sense, although they act a lot like them and have a lot of the same powers, so maybe they are, and what is a god after all, that sort of thing. I also enjoyed the reputation system, which reflects choices made in dialogue. For example, if you're regularly honest, you build up a reputation for honesty, which you can then effectively cash in and have people take your word on something even if you lack evidence. It's not always easy to be honest or benevolent, so you have to decide whether you want to sacrifice the short-term gain you may get from lying or for withholding information for that larger benefit you may get later. There are also regular attribute and skill checks, so you can use stats like intelligence or resolve to push conversations towards a desired outcome. Some skill checks apply to your race or background, but not many. I didn't feel like my race made much of a difference overall, which was surprising given that I had chosen to be a rare and visually distinctive moon godlike character. I've criticised the storytelling, but one excellent decision was to use these choose your own adventure sections instead of cutscenes. Cutscenes would have been expensive and time consuming to make and wouldn't have fit in with the style anyway. It's one thing for a quick animation to have your characters walking around a room, but swinging across chasms or climbing mountains is a little tricky to show in an isometric CRPG. So you get these text boxes and illustrations instead. I love them and found them surprisingly immersive. The writing does a great job describing the action and peril your characters face, and the sound effects are so good you can easily imagine what's happening off screen. You typically choose a character to undertake a task, so you send someone strong and athletic for a physical task, or someone with stealth if you're sneaking. You can also use tools like grappling hooks if you have them. You rarely fail completely, and I never had a party member outright die because of a bad choice, but they can get severely injured with, say, broken legs, and you can miss out on loot or the opportunity to save NPCs. Pillars of Eternity wants you to feel at home in Deerwood and gives you a keep to manage. This is where the massive dungeon is located. This stronghold, inspired by those offered in Baldur's Gate 2, is a fantastic idea, but as with the dungeon below, it was a Kickstarter stretch goal that probably didn't get the time and attention it needed. When you first take it over, the stronghold is a complete mess. You have to spend money to fix it up. Initially, this looked like a good way to take money out of the otherwise overly generous economy, but repairs aren't actually that expensive. Some of the improvements give you stat buffs when you sleep there and generally make the place look a lot nicer. Weirdly, you can build jails and populate them with bad folk you meet on your journey. However, the whole thing is a bit sterile. There's no big reward or recognition for completing the stronghold, and I couldn't enjoy exploring the restored property because going in all the new buildings and moving between the floors triggers so many load screens. Post-release, Obsidian added a quest where you must deal with a claimant to the property, which ends with a massive fight on a large battlefield. It's an impressive quest and made me a little more attached to the building, but not that much. While I've had plenty of complaints, I am encouraged to see Obsidian end on a strong note with the White March expansion. It doesn't fix all of the base game's problems, but it improves on enough areas to give me hope for Pillars of Eternity 2. White March is light on story, but what it has is solid enough. You're tasked with restarting a dormant forge and then defending the area from a group known as the Eyeless. a race dedicated to preservation but unfortunately manipulated into destruction. The ending requires a sacrifice and it is possible to lose a companion permanently here, although I suspect most groups will make it out intact. White March offers some cool new weapons, which was very welcome because the weapons in the base game are a touch dull. I've been stuck with the same gear for a while at this point and was due an upgrade. The new weapons can be soul-bound to a particular companion, who can then complete relatively easy tasks like killing a certain number of enemies to boost the weapon further. You need these improved weapons because the enemies in White March are a lot more competent than those in the base game. They dish out a wider variety of attack types and are more likely to have strong defences. I had to start paying attention to strengths and weaknesses and think a lot more about exactly what type of damage I was dealing. I also started using a wider variety of priest spells to strengthen my party against certain attacks and to bring down enemy defences. There are a lot more magic users now and even other ciphers. I got wiped out by powerful attacks that took me completely by surprise. After hours of coasting through fights, I welcomed the additional, if modest, challenge on offer here. Given the harder content, it's strange that you're expected to do this expansion at around the halfway point. I did it about 3/4 through and was apparently over-leveled. White March also adds some cool new companions, one of which actually seems funny. Unfortunately, with games like this, by the time I get around to playing expansion content, I already have a settled squad and I don't want to change it up. I do appreciate the attempt to add a bit of humour though. The expansion does lean a little more towards combat than I would have liked, and that, combined with the snowy location, certainly brought Icewind Dale comparisons to mind more than with most of the base game. But overall I enjoyed it and I appreciated seeing Obsidian refine the systems it had created for the base game. The problem with nostalgia-based games is that you end up comparing them to the best the genre had to offer, and you tend to forget the rest. Kickstarter projects particularly suffer from this because they have to remind you of those classic games to get financial support, but then they have to live up to not just the quality of those games but the memories people have of them. Ultimately, Pillars of Eternity fails to live up to Baldur's Gate 2 and Planescape Torment. However, it's better than Icewind Dale and the first Baldur's Gate and probably Icewind Dale 2 and Temple of Elemental Evil, although I haven't played much of those two. That's still a noteworthy achievement, especially because Obsidian designed its own world and combat system instead of relying on the well-established systems and the world of Dungeons and Dragons. My own review is nowhere near as positive as the critical consensus back on release. Partly that's just my style, but I think it also speaks to the sense of excitement around finally getting a new Infinity Engine style game after such a long absence. I can't imagine what it must have felt like for someone who played and loved those games back in the late 90s to finally get a new one after nearly 15 years. I only played those games a few years ago and it was the enhanced editions at that. I didn't have a 15-year wait. The success of Pillars of Eternity helped revive a genre, but that revival means Pillars of Eternity now doesn't stand out the way it did on release. This may be why the sequel didn't seem to have quite the same level of commercial success, but that's a subject for a later video. Alright, if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. If you'd like to support future content, then I have a Patreon where you can sign up for $1 a month. I'm not sure what the next video will be. The next one in this series on Isometric CRPGs is Underrail, but I may do another project first. I have lots of ideas, it's just a case of getting them done. I can't promise any particular date anymore. As many of you may know, I don't work full time on the channel these days. I simply couldn't get it big enough to support that level of work. The schedule just has to be more sporadic now, although I am trying to get videos out as fast as I reasonably can manage. Okay, until next time. Cheers.